Hello, everyone. Good evening. This is HLM Radio. This is the founder and director of HLM, Enrique Sanchez, and I'm here speaking with one of my administrators, Ivan. And tonight's topic is going to be about the vision of HLM, and I'm going to introduce Ivan. So go ahead, Ivan. Introduce yourself for the audience.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for your time. Hello, everyone. My name is Ivan Caban. I'm currently one of the administrators for the Hispanic Lives Matter page and movement. The way I discovered this group was actually interesting because I, I guess you would say I've met Enrique through other groups over the last many months and stuff. Um, and somehow that turned into an interesting relationship as far as like getting to know one another um as people and as individuals. um what do I like about this what do I like about this group? It's a very interesting concept for me because I'm growing up, I always was interested in stuff like Latino or Hispanic civil rights matters. I've always been proud of my um, Latin Hispanic culture roots. I mean, I'm originally born in Miami, Florida. Um, I come from a diverse background, half Colombian from my mother and half Puerto Rican through my father. Although although the Puerto Rican side of my family had a very profound impact on me. I've been to both places. Both cultures are very proud and diverse and within their own right, and they have their particular place in the Hispanic world, if that makes sense. And I grew up around grandparents that came from that old school era where they instilled in me that honor and proud of one's origins,
Hmm.
and one which you don't always see a whole lot nowadays because the passage of time.
Hmm.
And my grandparents were born during the the Depression era,
Hmm.
mid 30s.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is pretty interesting how we met because I was originally approached by the New Era Young Lords, and I had spoken with them originally, but then we kind of had our differences that I felt it wasn't going to be compatible, so we went our separate ways. But I think I found you by chance because I had shared something that had to do with the page, and that's how we became acquainted. And
Hmm.
one of the things that I promote in HLM that unlike other groups is that there's a way to approach and to do methods without having to go out into the streets and protest or rioting because I believe it's very counterproductive. And I see that other Hispanic groups tend to be very tribal or very based on one race, meaning that if they're Afro Latino, they're white Latino, or indigenous Latino, and it's like other Hispanics are like excluded. So that's what makes HLM different is that all Hispanics are included as united as one people because that's one of the things that is affecting our communities that they are so divided is that they don't get along with each other and they don't work together, and that's the reason why our community just doesn't move forward. So I think that with this movement and with the right people and the right talents and the right contacts, we can take this platform to a whole new level. Anything,
Interesting.
anything else you would like to say or comment?
Okay. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I mostly agree with the general mission statement you have. Um, I guess you could say I'm a little bit more flexible when it comes to how I would approach those situations like that. I
Mhm.
do feel that I do feel that when it's I mean, just my personal views. I do feel when it's necessary, such such measures should be entertained if it's absolutely necessary, like the protests and stuff. But I do agree that there should be other ways in which one could approach it. It doesn't always have to be about, you know, that should, let me not get too caught up here. But yeah, I think one should entertain new ideas on how to move forward as a community,
Mhm.
because I think I think now is that time, and I think now is that time in history where it shouldn't be hard for any of us, well, specifically referencing the Latin community, to do that. I mean, I think the time of our grandparents, and by that, like, I had grandparents that were born before, like, both sets of my grandparents were born before World War II and all that stuff. So I have older grandparents, or did. I believe that wave is slowly passing away as time goes on, and give another 10, 15, possibly 20 years is basically in the history books. I think it's time as a Hispanic community, whether it be historical groups that immigrated at different times in history, whether it be the Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, Cuban Americans, the historical groups that come to define an era or generation. I think it's time for them to start thinking past this whole notion that we're new groups to the U.S. Because I mean, we are part of the we are, although technically immigrant groups, we are a part of the greater community of the Americas, North, South, and Central America,
Mhm.
the Western Hemisphere. And I believe that as a Hispanic community, we need to start thinking those terms,
Mhm.
and not think that we have to downplay our own sense of identity just because it's not the quote unquote the U.S. way according to certain people, if that makes sense. Just speaking off the record. So.
Do you believe that self-hatred also plays a reason why Hispanics don't want to assert themselves like other groups do, or is it because they're conformist?
It could be. I do believe it could be a combination of both. But yes, I do believe there's strong self hatred in the Hispanic community, and it doesn't. It's not. It is. And there's also a lot of strong colorism in the Hispanic community. It's almost too. It's so embedded. People almost never notice it, even when it's being done in front of you.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
I believe that's the problem.
Mhm.
And the other problem is that yes, there's always been this tendency of wanting to hold back from any real, assertiveness, because I think we as a community, whether it be historical or now, they've always seen other groups like the like for example, like they see people have seen the struggles of stuff like different communities like the African Americans, or Asian Americans, or other groups of communities that had to at some point, whether it be even the Native Americans with their struggles, their historical, they've seen other groups suffer because of the consequences of them speaking out on stuff. And there's always been this notion in different communities that, oh, no, that's not for us. Let's just do what we were here to do, and go to work and pay the bills, and they want to stay under the radar.
Mhm.
I like I feel like it's time to move on from that. We're not guests in this country anymore. Well, we were
Mhm.
never, some of us were never really guests at all, because I mean, with the Mexican Americans that were here before the U.S. took over parts of the Southwest and Texas and California.
And Arizona and New Mexico.
And yes, and technically Florida, because they don't even talk about this as much either. Florida was once a Spanish colonial possession before it got ceded to the U.S.
Yeah,
So technically, that
but in the case of Florida, they didn't fight over it. It was bought over from the Spanish. Same thing with the Louisiana Purchase.
yes, yeah, yeah. Oh, I'm glad you even brought that up because both the French and the Spanish at different times uh, uh, ran Louisiana, but that's a different history altogether.
Hmm.
But it's worth noting because that's how interesting the history of this country is, and it overlaps with a lot of like Spain's colonial history, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
So
So, a question I wanted to ask you, Ivan, is what is your vision and what is your impact that HLM has done for you since you've decided to join and decided to become an administrator? So, like, what do you feel HLM has done for you, has impacted your life, and what is your vision for HLM?
it's interesting that you asked me that because every day I'm just thinking about how I can how I can how I can go forward. I'm still learning. I'm still learning myself. I'm still trying to find ways on how I can approach this with dignity and honor and self-respect. And I will say this: my vision, I guess where I'm at now, I do believe that this movement, if done properly and correctly, with, because of the time period, because of the stage we're at in life, I do believe it's time to make a huge, I guess, for lack of a better term, power move as far as asserting our place in history. Where, like, for example, I do believe in a sense of self preservation. I do believe that we need to, although we have a specific vision on how we can become in the future, I do believe that there needs to be a stage of reconciliation amongst our communities where we're going to have to come to terms with the good, the bad, and the extreme ugly of our communities, of our elements of our community, because that's the only way any real change is going to happen. We're going to have to address the taboos, the of what plagues the communities, because I think desperate times call for desperate measures, and it's sad that I have to say it like that. Some people might call me radical for it, but we live in a radical time right now. I mean, we live in the era of COVID-19, where you can't just we can't just act all freely like we once did, because we have to come home and take care of our families, not stay as healthy as possible.
Hmm.
And it's a different, I just feel like, I guess if you could rephrase that question, if I'm not answering this correctly, but I just feel like all kinds of stuff needs to happen and take place if we're going to do if we're going to approach this whole situation correctly as a community. I think
Hmm.
it's time to accept, I mean, without compromising one's personal beliefs. I mean, some people, we're gonna, a lot of us are gonna come from different aspects of life, whether it be religiously, culturally, spiritually, all kinds of walks of life. I think it's time for us to sit in a room, metaphorically speaking, put the ideas on the table and just discuss ideas, because that's all we have left now
Hmm.
is ideas and brainstorming, if that makes sense. Even if, you know,
Yeah, one of my biggest concerns is that because of the whole situation going on in the United States with different political groups, different people, I feel that Hispanics are always seen as the scapegoat or the boogeyman
mhm.
of everybody's fears, and that's something that needs to be addressed, is because uh,
Mhm.
Hispanics always get bullied when it comes to the economy going down, when it comes to jobs, when it comes to education, when it comes to housing. And the Hispanics, it's like they always get bullied. And I just feel that it's not fair because why is it that we're singled out and other groups are not singled out? And I think the short answer to that question would have to be that we don't have the political and the economic power that other groups have. Even though we are larger in numbers compared to everybody else. And that's one of the reasons why I started HLM, because I want HLM to have some type of uh, some type of goal into giving protections to Hispanic people, because I feel that other organizations and movements have failed. I feel that liberals, conservatives, white, black, Republican, Democrat haven't really done anything for the Hispanic community except to pander and to use for their own benefit, but they don't they don't help the Hispanic community achieve itself. And I think it's up to ourselves to try to do that, you know. And I think Hispanics need to stop trying to be like other cultures or whatever, because at the end of the day, America is always going to be a white and black country. And if you have ourselves that we want to be white or black, that's just going to cause problems. And I think we need to assert our own identity, have our own community. At the same time, we need to look after each other. That's one of the reasons why I always mention that the Asians, even though they are a much smaller minority than Hispanics and blacks, they thrive. And the reason why they thrive because they look after each other and they take care of each other. They build networks, like particularly like the Chinese, overseas Chinese live in America. They have something that's
Mhm.
called the Bamboo Network, where they establish economic links and cultural links with Chinese all over the world, and they help each other out. And I've mentioned this before, when you go to the enclaves of the San Gabriel Valley, all that area is all Chinese. And even though they don't speak the language, many of them don't, they thrive. And the reason why they thrive is because they invest in each other. What's your what's what's your opinion?
My opinion. Okay. I mean, I understand your position on that. I mean, I'm gonna slightly elaborate on my interpretation on the black and white country thing. I do. I mean, I guess you could say that's true to an extent. That is a historical issue with this country, where even in the distant past, they had to, because legacy, Jim Crow, segregation, and all that. And I'm just a humble person on this, claiming to be an expert, but just thing is, yeah, that era, that I think, yeah, that's gonna be quite a challenge for Hispanics to get over, because I mean, I've noticed as I was growing up, and even at my time coming into my own as a grown man, a grown adult here. I noticed that a lot of certain Hispanic, certain Latins, the ones I probably ran into the past, whether it be from childhood all the way up to this current time, they do struggle with that sense of identity. Some people view identifying with the skin color as a personal preference, because, oh, I feel this way, so therefore I am this way.
Mm-hmm.
And or or they shy away from terms like Hispanic, because, like, oh, because it's a inferiority complex. Oh, well, that's not a real label. That doesn't really exist, because you know you have to choose a side or whatever. And it's like, I think those days are over, as far as having to, oh, we've come to this point in time, so therefore now it's time to separate from whatever an archaic notion was. Like, oh, well, that was the era of our forefathers, now we're different. I think that whole self-segregation thing is over. I feel like people younger than myself, and I'm about to be 32 come this month,
Mm-hmm.
it matters, but not really. Like we have to find a way to assert our identity while still being able to get along and work with these other community of these non-Hispanic communities because I feel like it's okay to borrow ideas, but yes, I do agree that we're gonna have to come into our own and find our own momentum to address certain issues that only our Latin communities will truly understand. That they might have a better understanding of working with each other if we just talk about our own experiences, including our very origins. Because a lot of people, I feel like a lot of people don't know our history and don't care to know our history, and that includes people in our own communities because they think it's just a thing of the past. Because oh well, we're in the United States now, we're Americans now. They want to drop their ethnic identity for the greater nationality. And I'm like, I feel like you could be a proud American and still identify with the historical ethnic identity because we helped build this country.
Mhm.
Some of the earliest origins of our country references remnants of what used to be a historical notion of us. Like, I mean, Spain. If you want to talk about how this continent was taken over, Spain and the other powers had a part in settling the Americas, and that includes parts of the United States. And I like to see things from a historical perspective.
Mhm.
I mean, and try to find ways to reconcile with the modern.
Mhm.
I feel like that's a part of it. We need to know who we are first before we could start trying to be. I mean, I guess I'm kind of getting a little ahead of myself. I just feel like so many things has to take place. We have to find who we have to come to terms with who we are as a people first, and once we do that, where do we go from there?
I agree. I agree. Do you believe that the way we could do that is to try to get people to change their minds? Do you believe that there should be reforms in the Hispanic community before um, we could finally come to terms with who we are? Because it saddens me that the Hispanic community is way behind the Asian community and in many cases the African American community.
Perhaps, perhaps I do feel that we need to learn from these examples of these other communities on how they got to where they got to, good, bad, and the ugly,
Mm-hmm.
and try to learn from the mistakes of you know the past. And I mentioned before the era of Jim Crow, segregation, slavery, and all that stuff. We need to learn about the history of this country tops because we are here under the jurisdiction of the U.S. government, and we have to know what's going on. But once we master that element, we do need to tap into our own history of our origins because a lot of stuff overlaps the history of this country because territorial expansion. I mean, Puerto Rico is a U.S. territorial commonwealth and basically a colony, which that's a taboo word for certain people because of politics. But we have to tell the truth.
Is
It,
the is it
if the,
it actually is the oldest colony in the world.
Correct. That title once belonged to Ireland before they were granted autonomy, independence by the British, and then we took over that. Well, Puerto Rico took over that designation.
Right.
Yeah, I know that was a little bit of extra history, but I'm a history person at heart, so
I'm a history
it
teacher
is.
myself. That's what I teach. That was my specialty.
I do believe that the Hispanic issues that exist in the greater Hispanic community, there has to be some reconciliation of how Puerto Rico is going to turn out. Because a lot of people are either for statehood or independence or just want to stay as they are, Commonwealth. I think that's going to be the centerpiece of of Hispanic issue in the coming years and or generational stuff, because it's a lot of people like to ignore Puerto Rico because it's not relevant to the political situation historically of what goes on, because people only focus about what happens on the, in my personal opinion, the lower 48, or they view it as a third world country, which is like, it's under the system of the American government. How is it a third world country? If it's a third world country, it's because it was set up that way. Like,
I agree with
it's this benign, it's this cultural benign neglect where people ignore it on purpose because they see it as a lesser thing because, oh, it's not convenient.
Right. What makes it sad is that even though Puerto Rico is considered, I mean, even though Puerto Rico is part of the United States, in many ways, Puerto Rico is seen as not part of the country. They're not seen as Americans. They're still seen as foreigners in many ways.
That's true. I mean that's true to an extent. I know, and it's sad as well because, at least especially amongst the diaspora, we help define certain cultural phenomenons and throughout history. And I'm going to use the most important example, which doesn't always get talked about: the evolution of hip hop music and culture.
Hmm.
It's, although it's considered and seen as a predominantly African American subgenre and culture, it cannot be, and I'm not disputing that, because it's facts, it's history. We have to acknowledge the facts. Latinos especially Puerto Ricans in New York, had a strong foundation in the evolution of early hip hop alongside with the African Americans in the earliest parts of the genre. People like the rapper Buster Rhymes has acknowledged this. Many people connected to the old school origins of the culture have referenced this. And I feel like that's an avenue we as Latinos need to explore to spread our message, especially for this group. And we need to get away from the notions, and I'm speaking to the Latin audience from an older generation. We need to get away from the notions that that's black music, or that's the stuff of black people, because we helped start it. We helped start it. Well, and I'm not excluding the African American element. I'm honoring it, but we have to be able to tell our story too within, because this is now considered one of the most popular music and subgenres in the world, or subgenre cultures in the world. We have to be able to tell our story and not let people erase us from the history books just because it doesn't fit a paradigm between black versus white. That's going to be another challenge. Record companies didn't know how to market to us back in the days when it got popular, and they used to tell people who were in that world, well, you always got your salsa music, you always got your Latin music. They tried to pigeonhole you into a stereotypical notion as though we're fresh and brand new to this country. We've been here.
I
I think
remember one time. I remember, not to cut you off. I remember one time, Mark Anthony, when he was starting to make music in English back in the early '90s. I remember that he was in an interview. The interviewer said, what's it like for you to cross over into the American market? And he said, crossed over? I never crossed over. I've always been here. It's like he was treated like he was like a foreigner entering into the U.S. market.
indeed. I mean, Mark Anthony was kind of like the bridge between before my time, and I was a kid when I first heard the name Mark Anthony. I mean, I think the first memory of Mark Anthony was that song he did, "I Need to Know," back in the '90s. And I was only a kid back then, but it makes sense. It makes sense that he feels that way because you know he did grow up in New York, and he was exposed to all this the phenomenon and stuff, and he was kind of like somewhat before my time, but not really, because I grew up knowing who Mark Anthony was. So it's interesting that you quote that. I think you're a few years older than me.
Yeah, I'm about like 7 or 8 years older.
Yeah, because I'm about to be 32 by the end of this month. So.
Mm. So, is there anything else you would like to say about how HLM has impacted your life? How has it made it better for you?
Okay, okay, perfect. Okay, perfect. Um, I mean, it's been pretty positive for the most part. I mean, there had, there has been some hiccups because, the difference in opinions and beliefs of the different people involved, especially the leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not a person I'm not a person that shies away or discredits that. I want to deal with people who share fundamental differences in beliefs, thoughts, political, social, religious views, or whatever. I mean, I would like to think of myself as set in my ways when it comes to upbringing, but I'm willing to listen to somebody
Mm-hmm.
from another world as long as there's mutual respect. Like, so how did you get to where you got to here, and why do you feel or believe the way you believe?
And
And
I
I
feel,
feel like
and
we
I,
need.
yeah, and I'm sorry, I feel that that's a thing that's missing today in our society is that there is a lot of lack of respect among different peoples. Like today, if someone has a difference in opinion, it's like they automatically see you as an enemy, and it wasn't like that. There was a time in America where we had a balance that you had left and right, but you always had that middle balance. Unfortunately, you don't have that anymore. It's like you're either left or right. If you don't belong to either side, it's like you are basically on your own. And the other side accuses you of being the other side when you are not even part of that other side, just because you don't subscribe to that belief.
Yeah, a lot of fanaticism, and on all ends, a lot of ends of the spectrum.
Mm,
It's kind of. I feel like the HLM movement can be the counterbalance to help restore this country's balance when it comes to tolerance in one's beliefs. I think we can be that bridge for the rest of the nation to kind of reintroduce that sense of, if I don't, excuse me if I get too repetitive, that 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 restoration of balance,
mm-hmm,
where we're already going to be like, in some areas we're already going to be seen as the infiltrators because we're trying to assert our community, and we're not trying to copy. I guess the perception I get is we're not trying to copy, or at least we're trying to come up with our own momentum while we thrive in this country.
mm-hmm,
We also have to think that some of our people will become leaders of this country, and they're going to have to serve, like let's say, as they get elected into Congress or just leadership roles. We're going to have to deal with people from other communities, not of our own, but we're going to have to excuse me,
sure.
learn how to cooperate with the interest of other groups while staying true to our core mission statements, that while staying true to the best interest of, quote unquote, the Hispanic communities.
Mm-hmm,
We have to find a way to get along with others while still staying true to our values, staying true to our way of how we're going to go about this that's unique to us. I
mm-hmm.
feel like there has to be I don't know, I mean, excuse my lack of vocab on trying to express this, but I feel like it is going to be an interesting few years to figure out these things as time goes on.
Mm-hmm. And how do you feel? How do you feel that you could do something positive like in your local community?
Mm. Well, for one, I mean, for me, that's an interesting thing because I do live, I live here. It's good. The thing about me is that I live just outside of Houston, Texas. Live in the outskirts here, surrounding areas. And the thing that I feel would be essential for me to make a profound impact out here is, well, for one, you have to know people in the city in order to make certain changes and impacts. And for me, I feel like an idea we can do is like we need to come up with like ways to bring communities together, like social mixers. I've been emphasizing. I've had a lot of time to think about, like, look, what's going to happen post COVID-19 era. A lot of people are going to want to come out. A lot of people are going to want to do stuff that they couldn't do for about a year because of the pandemic. People are going to want to let loose because of all the stressfulness, and then we just got over with an election. I think it's time to encourage our own to celebrate who we are, and one way we're going to do that is through music. This Latin culture has always been historically rooted in it, been proud of its musical roots. We have so many rich traditions of music throughout the diasporas throughout Latin America: salsa, merengue, bachata, cumbia, Mexican music, regional Mexican music for their communities, and
Tango.
just the tango in Argentina, you know, Pasa Doble, or if you want to include the Spaniards, because the Spaniard, I mean, La Madre Patria, the mother, the colonial, La Madre Patria, basically, as some people in our community still reference it as. You know, we even amongst the Spaniards, they've had a rich tradition, and that's where we get a lot of our, you know, historical, spiritual roots of who we are as a people. So I mean,
Mhm.
we need to use music to bring people together, and I feel like we could do social mixers for so to get people used to the idea to celebrate who we are. And music is like my personal opinion, like a therapy, if that
Mhm.
makes sense.
Well, it
Dancing,
is. It is.
let
I agree with you.
go ahead, Enrique.
No, I said I agree with you, but I also believe another way that we could also fix our community as well is also to do outreach. I think the
Agree.
Hispanic community is neglected in many ways, and I think the best way to bring outreach and change is that we need to build up communities. We need to invest in the communities. It's like the trend that I see with many Hispanics is that once they become wealthy or they become well-to-do, instead of staying in the community and trying to make it better, they just leave, and counterproductive.
I'm glad you brought that up. You just brought this conversation back to a well-rounded state. Yes, yes, there needs to be more outreach programs, especially catered to the youth, because a lot of the youth, in many cases, they don't always have good role models. The
Mm,
ones that don't, and not every, and I mean, don't get me wrong. There's good role models in every group, but I think what needs to be emphasized is there has not just good role models, but good leadership skills. We need to come up with programs to teach the younger kids good leadership good leadership skills.
mm.
And can you kind of elaborate on what you were saying before? I'm trying to
Uh,
gather my thoughts here.
Elaborate as far as outreach, yes. I think one of my plans or goals that I have in outreach is that I think we need to set up community centers. We need to invest in vocational training, educational training. I think we
Hmm.
also need to provide food food pantries, uh, libraries for students to take books at
Hmm.
home because a lot of them cannot afford it. And I also believe that we also need to put more hospitals, clinics, and centers in the community so that way people have access to it. And again, going back to the Asian community, like a very good model that I've seen as an example would be this center that's called the Herald Christian Center, which is actually
Oh,
run by Chinese Christians, but they
oh
welcome
wow.
everybody. They welcome everybody. But I do have to say that in every area of San Gabriel Valley, let it be Arcadia, Temple City, Rosemead, Monterey Park, etc., they have these centers everywhere, and in all these centers um, they have dentistry, optometry, um, healthcare, etc., and it's all made affordable to little to no cost to the patient. And that gives a lot back to the community because you cannot have a strong community if they're not healthy. That's also another thing I wanted to elaborate. Hispanics have one of the worst diets in the country, and in many cases worse than African Americans. They consume a lot of sugar, a lot of salt, a lot of pork. They don't exercise. There's a lot of alcohol abuse, drug abuse, sexual abuse, teenage pregnancy, all these type of things. And I believe that in order to have a strong community, you have to have a healthy community. And the only way you can have a healthy community is that you have to provide resources and tools for people to use. And this is something I disagree with conservatives. Is that conservatives have, and not to put down conservatives, is that they believe is that you cannot invest in anything, you can't help anybody. If they do it, great. If not, it's their fault. And that's not the case. You have many people that do want to better themselves, that do want to move forward, but they've always been beat down so much is that they get discouraged. And I could say from experience going through the high school system to the school system that the teachers have been conditioned to fail the students because they have this way of thinking that if this student is Hispanic, he's going to be stupid. He's not going to pay attention in class. He's going to gang bang, shave his head, wear tattoos, sag his pants. And that's not the case. It's like they generalize all Hispanic students being the same. So you have Hispanic students that want to move forward, that want to be educated, that want to learn. But you have teachers that look at these students as like they don't have any value. And that needs to change because it is not the teacher's job to make sure that the student does their homework when they get home. And the same way, it is not the parents' job to make sure that their children get educated when they're at school. That's where you got to work together. The teachers, the school board, and the parents, from what I have seen, they like to point fingers at each other instead of saying, you know what, we cannot be doing this because we're failing the kids, we're failing the students. That's the reason why Hispanics have the highest dropout rate out of everybody, more than African Americans, and that's very alarming. That's something that needs to change. And the only way we can change that is that we have to make centers, establish centers, so that way, if they're not getting their education in the schools, at least they could go to a place where they could do their homework, get tutoring. And again, to mention the Asian community again, the Chinese community in San Gabriel Valley, they have centers where they not only teach language, but they also teach academics. Kind of similar to like Sylvan Learning Center, where they get tutoring different subjects, and that's how they move forward. But you have to invest. Hispanics have a problem that they believe that investing money in your children is a waste of time. And that's a very negative way of thinking because the biggest investment you could do is for your children. And the only way you could invest in your children is that you gotta invest not only in money but also in time. And that's the problem. Hispanics feel that by giving their children just a BS job or a BS career, that's giving them the future. No, it's not a future. It's like you can't just stay where you are and just continue because that cycle's never gonna break.
I'm glad you brought that up. I'm glad you brought that up because I can I mean this was I mean I remember hearing stories my about my one of my parents growing up, and you know, and I guess that analogy you used kind of fits somewhat with that situation. Like there are, especially especially if you're dealing with people who are like, especially like the older generation that tended to be more conservative. They didn't want to let go of their kids. They were fine with somebody working probably at McDonald's or a manager at Walmart and leave it at that. Like, and it was like, why do you want to leave us or whatever? Like, they were fine with just with people working a minimal job or for example, like discourage their kids from like I I don't know because I don't want to say too much because that scenario was a little bit before my time, but I remember hearing stories of when I was growing up about you know people that would have been like amongst my parents' peer groups, and you still heard stories like that where some people could have gone to college but didn't because they didn't have the support of their families.
No, you're right. You're right. You're absolutely right. And that's another thing that Hispanics, unfortunately, they're very clingy with their kids, and they don't want their kids to leave them because it's like in their culture, they feel that the children have to take care of them when they get old.
Yeah, but then how are those kids going to take care of them when all they have is like at best a 12th grade education? And then
Exactly.
and some people if you and some people who drop out, I don't know about nowadays, but I've heard stories about people 30, 40 years ago. It was still a thing as late as the 80s where some people didn't even have, they barely had an eighth grade education because that's how little they cared about school. And those would be the same people that would end up in the street life, whether it be a gangster or, a career criminal or something. And, granted, I had to take in consideration that things were probably different back then because of the racism and stuff and this and that, but not that it's an excuse, but there's so many opportunities. I'm just saying that right now because even now I think there's so many opportunities nowadays for us that people in our grandparent, whether it be our parents or grandparents generation, just didn't have. And yet you mentioned that there's a large high school dropout or not high, just a dropout rate in general, or Hispanics not being taken seriously by society. I mean, here we are 2020 and people still almost act almost entitled to assume that we're just going to be in a subservient position because
Right.
they project it on us.
Right.
And
They
it's like,
believe they believe that Hispanics, their only view is to be used as a slave, or in the case of Hispanic women, they're to be used as a toilet seat when other races are just horny, and when they're done using them, they discard them and then go back to their spouse. I've seen this
and
many times with a lot of black men, white men, Asian men, and even Middle Eastern men and Indian men.
my question to that is, and I'm not going to single out any specific group of people. Let's just let's just use the catch-all. I'm going to use that catch-all perspective here. I'm trying to understand, like, that might be a perception that exists, but I'm just trying to fathom if that's the perception out here. And yeah, there's some of us that feed into that narrative. Sadly, it's almost like, how do you even like? It's an interesting thing because it's like you can never get a break. You can never, and this is society's already cutthroat as it is, and no, and I just don't understand this whole notion where I think a lot of that has to do with the Hispanic. I think a lot of that has to do with a lot of that situation falls on, sadly, some of the Hispanic community, because
Mhm.
it goes back to this whole thing about wanting to stay under the radar, trying to trying trying to act like we don't want to know about what's going on with other people. We don't want to really. We just want to do our own thing. But how are you going to do your own thing if if most people don't even know you exist?
Exactly. And the only
Like
way you can, and the only way you can make yourself exist is by making an impact. Like Asians, they're pretty much invisible in everything in our society. They're invisible in political life. They're invisible in pretty much everything. But the only thing they're not invisible in is in education and economics.
that's true, and even though that is a wonderful asset for for the community, they too. I mean, I don't know. I guess I don't know. There's a sense of arrogance in this country when it comes to like again. It goes back to this whole benign neglect stuff where people purposely ignore you just because it's not convenient for them to sympathize with you. It's not convenient for them to see you as a human being. Like, we don't want to hear about your struggles because we don't care about your struggles. You're making us feel uncomfortable. Just go over there while we be over here because what you're bothering us. Oh, how dare you try to think that, like, there's this sense of benign
Hmm.
neglect that is a relic of stuff like Jim Crow and all this, not just racism, but oppressive racism, where now they use that as the divide and the powers that be use that as the divide and conquer, and they use other communities to combat against us. It's not.
I believe what we have today is more than anything else. We have economic racism, and I think economic racism blurs color lines. And I think that the only way we could overcome institutional and oppressive racism is, number one, overcoming economic racism. And the only way we could overcome economic racism is that we have to get ourselves educated in order to get access to high paying jobs. You know, that's the only way our society is going to change. Is we gotta have to be educated in order to get high paying jobs. If we don't do that, then nothing's going to change.
Hmm. I'm listening. I'm listening.
But yes, we are out of time. I wanted to thank you very much for the interview, Ivan. I appreciate it. For a short Q&A, is there any questions or final comments you would like to give?
I would like to point out that this is one of, like, this this interview, along with other stuff that I participated in because of these ties to the group and the greater community. I'm learning as I'm going along. I'm I'm actually learning a lot. I'm I'm coming into my own as a full member, as a not just as a full grown adult here, and I speak humbly because there's a lot of stuff that I wish I would have learned, or at least been exposed to somewhat when I was growing up. Like, like, I'm not gonna say that I didn't have opportunities or nothing, because I grew up with a family that, that cares about you. Like, two-parent household, this and that, you know, with certain dysfunctions that everybody, you know, to an extent goes through. But I just wish I would have learned certain information that I picked up because of these encounters with the group and members and the leaders and stuff. And, you know, I just feel like we I just want to say to everybody that this has been a wonderful experience, getting to know the likes of you yourself, Enrique, and the others in question. And only time will tell if and it's gonna be a wonderful journey trying to come up with ideas for the future. And this is one of my first few interviews that I'm doing with people that I've done. And you know, it's gonna be fun trying grow to grow with the information as time goes on, and really really try to be a part of solutions for something bigger than myself, if that makes sense.
Perfect. I think you answered perfectly. Thank you so much, Ivan, for taking your time to meet with me. I will wrap up the podcast and we will talk later. Have yourself a wonderful night.
You have a good evening.
Take care. Bye bye.
You take care of yourself. Bye bye.